Hello everyone. Today I want to start with the fourth round of the Tata Steel Masters section, and we'll look at a game between the world champion Dinglerin and Indian prodigy R. Pragnananda. Let's check out the game. Starts with e4, e5, knight f3 and knight c6, bishop b5, so we have the Spanish and Morphy's defense with a6. Bishop a4, knight f6, and d3, a more modest system. Bishop c5, claiming that diagonal, white castles, and b5. Bishop b3, d6, c3, h6, controlling g5 and not allowing the bishop to develop there. Rook e1, black castles. Knight b2, knight bd2, and bishop b6. Knight f1, a common maneuver towards the king side, and knight e7, a similar idea. a4. Maybe you're looking to exchange rooks or just create a weakness on b5, so rook b8, h3, preventing bishop g4, knight g6, knight g3, c5. Now the black central attack starts. Bishop e3, developing a piece, and c4. So black will try to exchange something. Bishop takes b6, and rook takes b6. Here, the best way to actually continue would be to capture on c4, and after black recaptures, you capture back on c4 and give up the b2 pawn. But this is not a very pleasant position to play with white because, well, queen c7 is going to come and that will x-ray the c3 pawn through the bishop, so you have to play bishop f1 first so you can defend the c3 pawn. But then knight f4, you can trade rooks. Let's say rook b1, rook into b1, queen into b1, then queen c7, and you can defend with queen b4. But probably this position will not give too much to the world champion, and that's why he went with after rook b6, he went with bishop a2, which is a slight inaccuracy. So black can actually even capture here. C takes d3, and if let's say a takes b5 first, then knight f4, defending the pawn and forcing bishop c4, because you can't let that pawn and the knight stay there. A takes b5 and bishop into d3 and b4, trying to create some weaknesses on the queen side, and black will probably get some isolated pawn, and the knight is placed quite well on f4. This would be slightly favorable for black actually. In fact, even slightly better than queen c7 which was played in the game. A takes and a takes, bishop b1 now. So of course white wants to keep the b file closed because black's rook is there. He takes d3, bishop takes d3, and knight f4. Knight e2, knight takes d3, and queen takes d3. To some extent, black has achieved a small victory because in the Spanish, the light square bishop can be a very dangerous attacking piece. So exchanging that is something good for black. Black is slightly better here. Well, bishop e6 now, completing development. Knight goes back to g3. b4. You want to create a weakness on the queen side and bring the other rook there. Very simple stuff. C takes, rook takes, and we can see that the d6 pawn for black is weak. Now how do we attack it? You can do rook ad1, which was played in the game, but a slightly better way is rook a6, and in this case there is no rook b6 because black does not really want to give up that excellent rook on the b file and bring the queen there, because then it will be easier for white to defend the b pawn if black were to give up one of the attackers of the b pawn. So knight e8 would be played, and this pushes black back to a certain extent because this knight is also blocking the f rook, and there'll be no rook fb8 now. So you can play something like queen c3. If black wants to avoid the queen trade, go queen b7 and then queen c6, but there is no avoiding now. Queen into c6, rook into c6. You are giving up the b pawn, but with some activity and consequent passivity for black. So this would be a better way to play it. But rook a1 was played in the game, and this allowed rook b6. Here you can play rook e1, just push the queen around, queen e7, and play rook ed1, get slightly more active pieces, and rook fb8 will come because there's no knight e8 in this line, and rook t2, and try to hold this. But this is favorable for black, no doubt, but this is slightly better than what was played in the game because queen a3 was played. And we see that in the previous line, essentially this e rook was on the c file, which is the open file, and that's slightly better than being stuck defending the e pawn. This simply allows rook fb8, no doubt about it. So rook d2 now knight e8. Black has no worries about the d pawn anymore, and we see knight e8 is not so bad now because the rook is activated already. In the previous variations, when we were going with rook a6, the rook was stuck on the f8 square, and then knight e8 is a bit of a hindrance for black, but not anymore. Well, knight h2, knight will come somewhere to f1, to e3, perhaps somewhere to defend. Rook b3, pushing the queen further back, queen to a1, and queen b6. You have a triple attack on the b pawn, and white is certainly on the defensive here. Not a very good psychological position. Knight hf1. Now I'll ask you to pause the video here and perhaps consider how should black continue to play this position. Should you just grab that pawn because you can, or should you play something else? Well, Praggnanandhaa grabbed the pawn, rook into b2, which still is good for black, but there was an even better way to continue, and that's with g6. And what it does is it actually stops white's counterplay. One, it threatens h5 and h4 and dislodges that knight from g3. It also controls the f5 and h5 squares, so the knight on g3 can't move, and it prevents h4 and h5 from white. And white doesn't have any active plans, so if something like queen c1, you can play h5. That b pawn can't really be defended properly anyway. There is no decent move to defend that, and black will always be able to attack it. So let's say something like knight e3, you can then grab that pawn, and black is doing very well here. But after rook into b2, there's an exchange of rook into b2, queen into b2, queen into b2, and rook into b2. In this case, white has the move h4. And after g5, white can throw in h5. Imagine if g6 were played before, then after white plays h4, black has h5, stopping that counterplay. And this will be difficult to actually convert into a victory, because let's say you play king f8, you just play a move, rook a1, knight f6, rook a8 check, king e7, rook a7 check, knight d7, h takes g6, f takes g6, knight e3, just developing that piece. Converting this position will be a lot harder than it would have been if we just go back and look at this position. The pieces are on the board, and there's a very strong battery on the b file. Black has time to consolidate and press on, versus here major pieces have been traded, and it'll be a very technical and a grinding endgame. So this would give the best drawing chances to white. But after rook into b2, Dinglerin did not find h4. He played knight e3, and it's a small change in the move order. We have g6 now, and now that h4, h5 is not possible, because if h4, then simply h5, and that stopped. So after g6, rook a1 was tried, and black can actually play h5 here and solidify that position, force h4 so that the knight is not dislodged, and then king f8, let's say f3, knight f6. The king could eventually land on e7, and you can push d5 eventually. Black would be clearly better here. But after rook a1, Pragnananda played bishop a2. And this is not as good. Idea being that you want to exchange a pair of rooks. But first h4, h5, stopping h5 from black, and then there's f3. There could also be, let's say, knight d1. You force rook b1 and then trade minor pieces this way. Black would be better here as well. But after f3, there's rook b1 check, rook into b1, bishop into b1, and knight e2. Knight is going to c3. Here, well, bishop a2 was played, and this gives white a chance to equalize straight away with knight c3 because you gain a tempo here. But if you look at the alternative, there was f5. And essentially, it clears the f7 square for the king to come up the board, so the king can come up the board faster. So if, let's say, king f2, king f7, knight to d5, knight f6, knight to b4, trying to control that bishop. Now you capture in the center. Knight c3, attacking the bishop, forcing bishop d3, and king e3. Let's say king e6 and f takes e4 and bishop c4. Both kings are active, but black has an extra pawn. And this endgame really is something in which black can push for a win. But after knight e2, bishop e2 was played, which allows knight c3 with tempo. You have to go back to e6, then there's g4. And again, white can equalize. H takes, f takes, let's say king g7, and then king f2. Black will have a very difficult time breaking through in this position. White can hold this if played properly. But king f2 was played, which is very logical because you want to activate the king, and you think, well, maybe Dinglerin missed the idea with how powerful g4 can be. But then king f8, now knight c3, and bishop b3. Knight ed5, this helps black, no doubt about it, because you can simplify. Bishop takes, knight takes. Now it's just a knight endgame with a pawn down for white. Now f5. Black is in complete control. There could be a little fight with knight e3, forcing knight g7, and white just has to hold the position, so let's say g3. But then king e7, slowly black will come forward. If knight d5, then king d7 is possible. King e2. There could be an exchange in the center. King e6 eventually could be played. There's no pressure on f5 anymore. The knight can be activated from g7, and black is fine and better, in fact. But this still holds the position. White actually played f4 here, and this clarifies the position for black, because now there will be exchanges in the center and black will have a very solid pawn mass. King f7 simply. E takes, g takes, f takes e5, and d takes e5. The simplification is good for black. g3, king e6, knight e3, knight f6, king e2, knight e4, going after the g3 pawn, and knight f1. f4 now. G takes, E takes, king f3, and king f5. King g2. Now here it's very normal to just go with king g4, thinking that you can grab the h pawn, but you have to be so careful in the endgame. Because let's say if knight h2 comes, pushing your king away, and you grab that h pawn, then king f3 hits the f pawn and the knight. If you save that knight, you lose the f pawn, and then the knight on h2 can sacrifice itself for the h pawn sometime or the other, and it will be a draw. 2 pawns up, it will be a draw. So after king g2, first knight d6. You're forcing white to move the pieces away from the king side, and then we'll grab the h pawn. The h pawn can't be defended anyway. Knight d2, knight f7. Knight c4, now king g4. King f2, king h4, King f3, and now the king can come to g5, and there's no knight on e4 to be threatened. Knight to b2, king to f5, knight to d1, knight to g5, king to g2, h4. Knight and the pawns control that king very well. Knight f2, f3, king g1, king f4, king to f1, and knight e4 was the last move in the game, because now there really is nothing to even try. If you exchange knights, the two pawns will easily win. Knight g3 is a threat, the h pawn is a threat, the f pawn is a threat. There is nothing more to be done. We can see, let's say knight h1, you try to go there, knight g3, you will exchange knights anyway. This could have happened, but Dinglerin resigned, and a very nice victory for Pragnananda. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.